Hi, everyone. Welcome once again to New Testament 500, New Testament Intro. It's great to have you in class with me. I'm here in my study at our home in Seabeck, Washington. And as we begin our course, I'd like to talk to you about a concept that's important to grasp before we begin our study of the New Testament. That concept is something scholars call the three worlds of the text. So let's start off our course with an introduction to that idea. The three worlds of a text, any written text actually, but in our case, the texts that make up the New Testament. The three worlds of a text are the world behind the text, which can also be called the world of the author and the audience. The world in the text, which can also be called the world of the text. And the world in front of the text, which can also be called the world of the reader. The world behind the text, the world of the author or the audience, the world in the text, the world of the text, and the world in front of the text, the world of the reader. Each of these three worlds is a world of space and time, whose boundaries are created by that world. In terms of space, each world has historical and cultural dimensions, including, to give you some examples, geographical space, political space, economic space. These three dimensions, geography, political realities, economic realities, help to define the space of a world. A world is also defined by religious and ideological dimensions. We might call these in 21st century language a worldview. And a world is also defined by cultural, social, sexual, and racial or ethnic realities. Those dimensions also define a world, don't they? So a world is defined, first of all, in terms of space, historically and culturally. And then a world is also defined in terms of time. Each world exists within the boundaries it creates, the boundaries that are created by the space of the world. So the time in the world behind the New Testament text is defined as the history before and the time during which the text was written, and the time immediately after, as it reached those who heard and read it. To understand the world that existed in that time for us means we need to travel back in time, from our time to that time. We need, as best we can, to travel back into the first century, when the author and readers of the New Testament lived. Traveling back through time to try and understand the world of the New Testament texts in their own historical, cultural, and time context like this means we are interpreting them diachronically. Diachronically. The word is spelled D-I-A-C-H-R-O-N-I-C-A-L-L-Y. The first three letters in that word, D-I-A in Greek, mean through. And chronos in Greek is the word for time. Now, let's take an example. In Mark 13:35, the New Revised Standard Version, Jesus tells his disciples to, and I'm quoting now, keep awake, for you don't know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn. So Mark divides the night, and Jesus divides the night into 4 watches, as was common in the Roman world before, during, and for some time after the time Mark was written. Or to take another example, in Mark 7:1-4, a conflict occurs between the Pharisees and Jesus' disciples concerning, Mark says, defiled hands and the tradition of the elders. What do both of those phrases mean in the world behind the text, the world of Jewish culture at the time they occurred? When did those phrases develop in Jewish history? And how did they change or not change during the time since they first originated until the time of Jesus and the time of Mark? Let's move on now to the time in the world in the text. Time in the world in the text is exactly what it says. It's the time that exists in the world created within the written text. And this can be the same as the time behind the text, or it can be different. As for example, in Luke 11, verses 5 through 8, where Jesus, speaking during the daytime, tells a parable about a man whose friend arrives at midnight asking for 3 loaves of bread. So as readers of this story, we need to enter into the parable and interpret it in its own time in 2 ways. Diachronically, asking ourselves, is midnight in the parable the same as 12 a.m. in modern time? And then also synchronically. That word is spelled S-Y-N, and then chronically. S-Y-N in Greek means in or within. Chronos, once again, means time. So, in terms of time in the world within the text, synchronic interpretation is what we will employ. Let's talk finally about time in the world in front of the text. This is the time that occurs chronologically after the text has been written by an author and during the time that it's read or heard by its original audience. After that, each person who reads or hears the text stands in front of it, looking at it, and interpreting what they see and understand the words to mean and say. In this way, the person who interprets the text gives it meaning from within their own context and out of their own experience. When a reader reads a text like this, or a hearer hears it, they understand it and give it meaning existentially. Existentially. E-X-I-S-T-E-N-T-I-A-L-L-Y. Existentially is a word that also may come from 2 Greek words. Ex come from a Greek preposition that means out or out of. And the other part of the word existential may come from a Greek verb that means to be. So the word existential means out of my being. Out of my being. In English, one dictionary defines the word existential as a meaning that grows out of a person's individual experiences. So when I interpret the meaning of a New Testament text, for example, like Matthew 15, verses 21 through 28, which is the story about the faith of a Canaanite woman who asked Jesus to drive a demon out of her daughter, my interpretation as a male looking at the text in front of me will be colored by my experience as a man, not a woman, living in the 21st century, not the first, living in American culture, not in Canaanite and Jewish culture. And my interpretation can be enhanced by reading the interpretations of others who have interpreted the text, both women and men, from different cultures in our world, and even different historic periods of interpretation, like the patristic period, or the Reformation period, or the modern period. Reading commentators from each of these periods can enrich our interpretation. Reading interpretations from different cultures can do the same thing. Reading interpretations by women as well as men can do the same thing. As we study New Testament texts, each of these 3 worlds will help us understand and give more meaning to the text that we're looking at from different perspectives. And because of that, they all deserve consideration. Sometimes, though, some people will advocate the interpretation of a New Testament text from the perspective of only one world, the world of the reader, for instance. Someone could argue that a reader shapes her or his own meaning from the text, and that is the only meaning of the text. They would say a text means only what it means to me. Or someone else could argue that the world of the author is the only world that gives a text meaning. They would say the only meaning of the text is its original meaning, the meaning intended by its original author and understood, presumably, by its original audience. Or, a third alternative, someone could and has in fact argued that the world behind the text and an author's intention in that world is irrelevant, because meaning and value reside only within the text of the finished, standing, public work of literature. But I and most other New Testament scholars would argue that no one world can provide a full meaning of a New Testament text. Only all three worlds integrated together can do that. So to understand a New Testament text, the three worlds should not be compartmentalized. They are not separate compartments. They are meant to be integrated. They are not contradictory. They are meant to be understood as complementary. And they are meant to be in conversation with each other, so that together they form a whole. In terms of an analogy, think about the three worlds like we think about the four accounts of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament. Together, those four accounts enable us to understand the one gospel. The accounts according to, as they're titled in our Bible, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John, those four accounts present us with four different perspectives on the life of Jesus that largely cohere together, but sometimes diverge apart. And when they diverge, these different perspectives are not competing with one another, they are complementing one another. And taken together, they provide us with a holistic account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection within the New Testament canon. In the next sections of this lecture about the three worlds of the text, we'll go ahead and dig a little bit deeper and say a little bit more about each of these three worlds.